Chris was right, it's incredibly mild. I do want to deny that I'm actually wearing long johns today. And welcome to Deeper in the Garden. The topic is taming tall perennials. I want to first say, put in a word for tall perennials. They add a lot of drama to the garden. And you know, if your beds are big, you certainly don't want everything to be 2 foot tall. You want some of these tall things either piercing low masses of shorter things or, you know, at the back of the border. And this is one of the meadow rus, Thalictrum. This is Thalictrum Rauschenbrunnianum. Somebody's lovely, I guess, maybe German family name, Rauschenbrunn. And despite its height, and I am well over 3 feet, actually I'm about 5'11". You see, it's taller than me. There's some here that have chosen not to get quite as tall this year. But it's just starting to bloom. Will be a cloud of, I guess that's sort of a lavender color for months in the summer, and generally stands up on its own, but that's not really our topic today. I just wanted to make the point that not all tall perennials need to be dealt with. There are so many really good hybrid lilies nowadays, but not all of them do a really good job of standing up. The volunteers who take care of the mixed border, which is where we are now, who call themselves the border babes, have these metal tomato cages, and they're black, so they sort of largely disappear from height. And it's important that they put this in while the lilies were still growing, because if you wait until they flopped on the ground, it's almost impossible to make something look right that has already fallen over. It's a big hybrid lily called Orania. And I wish you could smell it. The fragrance is really delightful. But you can see these few stems that grew beyond the tomato cage have flopped over. So that's one way to deal with a tall perennial, is to provide it support. We're going to jog over to another example of a tall perennial that needs help. We saw the meadow rue, the Thalictrum, and the lily. And one thing I want to say, that in nature, plants grow cheek by jowl. They're not generally standing out in the open. So in nature, plants are often supported by their neighbors. And that's another way. Hey, Carol. Hey, Carol. Hey, I thought that was you too. Good to see you. And so sometimes just planting a sprawly perennial with some more supportive neighbors is one way to deal with it. You can see this hibiscus has flopped over. This is a hybrid, Lady Baltimore. There's also a Lord Baltimore and an Anne Arundel, all Maryland names, bred, I think, by the National Arboretum. They're older hybrids, and these haven't gotten full height. They'll get 7 or 8 foot tall, so they're a lot taller than many of the modern introductions. And one, you know, sometimes things are worth staking because of the end result. So it's sort of a cost-benefit analysis. I wouldn't bother staking something that's going to be in bloom for 10 days or something like that. There might be something I get rid of, and that is one way to deal with flopping herbaceous perennials or any flopping plant. If it consistently falls over, then you know, maybe the best thing to do is to get rid of it and find a replacement for it. But these hybrid hibiscus will bloom for many months over the course of the summer, and they often will get to a point where you think, oh, they're done blooming, and then a few weeks later they have a whole new flush of bloom. And I have found with these hibiscus, if you stake them when they're young, they will, their problem seems to be at the base of the stalk. They seem to be weak down there, but if you stake them, in time they will strengthen up, and then they will stand up just fine the rest of the summer. This is not an especially big clump, but if this was a really big clump, another thing to do is you don't need to stake all 36 stems of it. Well, I was making the point that when something like this hibiscus becomes a really large clump, you do not need to stake all of the stems. You might select 5 to 10 stems and remove the rest. And I do mean remove the rest, like these little ones down here. Because if you have 5 to 10 full-size stems, they will make a gigantic display. And you could spend a whole day staking every stem, and you really don't need all of them. If you read older garden books, you know, back when people had 5 gardeners taking care of their home garden, there's often directions to thin the stems on a lot of herbaceous perennials like delphiniums or Phlox paniculata, the summer phlox. So instead of having, you know, dozens of stems, if you thin them out, then the remaining ones will be that much better. So this is an example of a large herbaceous perennial that tends to flop, but is really worth staking because it'll bloom for months and months all summer. Plant breeders often stumpify things, and they certainly breed short hibiscus. There's some that only get about 30 inches tall. I don't want a 30-inch tall hibiscus. I love the height and the drama of a tall one. Shorter plants are maybe better for the nursery industry because it's easier to bring a 30-inch tall hibiscus to the market, to the garden center, than one that's, you know, 6 or 7 feet tall. Another very worthwhile practice for tall perennials that tend to flop over is to cut them back hard. This is a chrysanthemum. It's a single red daisy chrysanthemum that's just glorious in probably September, October. But it had already gotten almost 3 feet tall and would continue to get taller and flop open. And then you have this big naked center with the stems sprawling out from the center. And they've been cut back pretty hard and they're branching out. And that way, instead of continuing to get tall, there'll be many more low stems and make a nice, dense, upright growing clump of chrysanthemums. And at the moment that you cut them back, you can also stick cuttings. My mom would do this every spring and just stick her cuttings directly in the ground. You'd have much better success if you rooted them in some good soilless potting mix and put them in the shade until they're rooted, and then you'd have more of them. We also do that with asters. This is one of the selections of the aromatic aster, Aster oblongifolius, which is a native aster. This is the selection Fanny's aster. It looks identical to Radon's favorite, which is also the same species. The difference is, and it's worth having both, because Radon will bloom all of October, and as it's finishing, Fanny's aster starts, and it'll bloom pretty much all of November. So it's great to have both of them, and they're really worthwhile asters. But you see, we got a little bit of it cut back, and that's shorter. It's not too late to cut it back now. It's June 23rd, and they're not going to bloom until November, so we can certainly cut them back now. And they never look great when you first cut them back, and it's not a very precise. It's not like pruning a tree when you want to be very precise in where you cut it. This is just to reduce their height, so you know, we might think, well, maybe this year they'll stand up on their own, but, you know, usually that won't come to be. They'll flop over just when they should be at their prettiest. So you see, I'm not paying a lot of attention to where I cut it. I'm just shortening the stems. And, you know, this is no longer the best condition for rooting, but you could. Or the other thing is, and this presentation isn't about rooting, but these new shoots that have been produced since these stems were cut back, those are prime condition for sticking as cuttings. But that's not really our topic today. So we talked about things, you know, that hibiscus, I would use a single stake on each stem and tie like soft twine around it, or maybe torn up bed sheets or something like that. And when you stake a stem, you don't ever want to just have one tie, because that tends to snap at that point. So you want to, you know, tie it at several locations. And we saw the tomato cages or similar cages on stuff like the lilies. Another thing you can do to provide support to plants. This isn't the best example, and I know Mark is not watching right now, but you know, let's say you have a privet hedge that is in, you know, needs to be reduced in size. Well, these can be good supports for shorter plants that need a little bit of support. If you ever read books about the vegetable garden, you'll hear about pea brush. Well, those are just stems of shrubs that are shoved into the ground and then provide support for the pea vine. So that's another way to support plants. And another thing I want to mention is if you have a lot of flopping perennials, it could be due to culture. Maybe you're feeding them too much. Maybe you're watering them too much. If you grow them hard, which means not lushly, they'll be much more likely to stand up. Or maybe you're growing a sun perennial in too much shade, and so it's growing soft and it's leaning to the sun and flopping over. So sometimes flopping perennials can be dealt with by improving their cultural conditions. The common gaillardia, you know, I grew up with that plant and it always flopped, but then you go down to the beach where it's growing wild on pure sand, and it always stands up really nicely because it's on a very, very lean diet. It's growing very hard. Are there any questions on any of this? You know, again, a good point to reiterate is it's always best to stake things before they flop. You know, stake them preemptively. And sometimes swapping out one cultivar plant for a new one. Peonies are a good example. Plant breeders have actually put a little emphasis on peonies that actually stand up when they're in bloom. So there's quite a few new varieties that stand up. You know, I grew up with Festiva maxima, that huge white one. And, you know, you might as well have named it Peony prostrata, because the flowers are always going to be flat on the ground. Or crinums, which are blooming now. There's one, Carolina Beauty. Yeah, there's a crinum called Carolina Beauty, and again, you can identify the plants because the flower stalks are always flat on the ground. So that's one crinum I don't grow, but almost every other crinum is good at standing up. So plant selection is another way to deal with you know, tall perennials that might otherwise flop. Did the audience have any questions on any of this?
I have a personal question. Yes. I think the audience would like the answer for. Why is it okay for you to willy-nilly, very quickly prune the aster like you did, but if that was a shrub, that'd be a no-no?
Because these are not permanent stems. And I actually was saying that I was saying you want to be extremely careful on how you prune a tree. I didn't say shrub, because on a lot of shrubs like a forsythia or a spirea, those stems are not permanent for the life of the plant. They come and go. So like if I was cutting back one of the summer flowering spireas, which tend to get hold last year's seed heads on the top of the plant, I'm not precise in where I cut them back. I just cut them down low enough that I'm cutting off all that old twiggy top growth, because that's going to persist if you don't cut it away. You know, with trees, and this is a small tree, this Chinese fringe tree, Well, these trunks are, you know, potentially permanent for the life of the tree, and you don't want to just cut it back any old where because you're going to destroy the structure. That's the problem with crepe murder, is that when you cut back a limb on a tree and it regrows, but you know, a limb is, if my arm is the limb of a tree, the unbranched limb is very structurally sound, but if you cut it back here and it sprouts 5 more stems, none of those are going to be properly attached. But any of the stems on these herbaceous plants are just here for this one growing season. Next year there'll be a whole new crop of stems. So it's a valid question. And you know, you can be as precise as you want. If you want to, you know, let's see, where should I cut this one? Let's cut it to this outward facing bud, and you know, you can make this as long a process as you want. I don't think it's worthwhile. You see, these chrysanthemums were just cut back. Someone might have even done it with a head shear, and they're resprouting a little bit irregularly, but in time you won't even know that it had been cut back. It'll be just a much more compact plant. Sometimes breeding shorter versions of plants works out for the betterment of the plant. Tithonia is summer annual. It looks like a scarlet orange zinnia, single zinnia, and the wild type gets about 8 foot tall and it flops over. You're guaranteed it's going to flop over. Might not even wait for a thunderstorm to flop over. While the plant breeders bred some that only get about, you know, maybe 4 to 5 feet tall. That's a good size. They stand up. But then the breeders then bred one that only got about 18 inches tall, and the plant was so congested it didn't do well. Or the hybrid salvia, the half-hardy salvia, indigo spires. Again, if that was able to stand up, it would be about 8 foot tall and it'd be glorious, but it always falls over. They bred one called mystic spires, indigo spires. They bred mystic spires that gets about 4 to 5 feet tall, and that's pretty good at standing up. But breeders have continued to make them shorter and shorter. There's, you know, not everything needs to be a ground cover plant, but sometimes making things a little bit shorter is a, you know, a worthwhile goal.
And Mark, you were saying a comment that you wanted me to hear?
Well, no, I thought you could not read the screen very well out there, so I was going to go through some of the questions for Doug. But if you can read them, then
yeah, I think I get there. Doug,
yeah.
Can all herbaceous perennials be trimmed, or are there some that won't need or won't take the trimming?
That's a huge number of plants to contemplate. There's some herbaceous perennials. Mark? I'm sorry, am I still here?
Hold on, Chris. Can you clarify that for Doug and really go in terms of bloom time, cutting off?
Did we lose?
How late can you cut the plant back before you lose bloom?
Sure. Yeah. How late can you prune to reduce size in the season?
All right. Do you want me to finish answering the previous question? The previous question was, are there some herbaceous perennials that you wouldn't prune? Well, there's some herbaceous perennials that only put up one flush of growth a year, and peonies are one. They put up the foliage in the spring, and that's the last growth they make all year. So if you cut that back, you're reducing the amount of leaf surface to photosynthesize. There's probably other examples that I'm not thinking of about. How late? Well, you know, the chrysanthemums and the asters are fall blooming. So midsummer might be about as late as you want to, but if you wait till midsummer, they probably have already fallen over. And not exactly on the same topic, but there's some perennials that we might cut back in like July or August, just because they've been in bloom since May or April and have now gotten shabby. And so we'll cut them back hard off into the ground and let them regrow. Some of the really long blooming salvias, like the mealy cup sage, Salvia farinaceae, we'll often cut that back hard. Or if you grow Verbena bonariensis, the moment it gets shabby, cut it to the ground and it'll regrow. You know, and also by time Verbena bonariensis, the verbena on a stick, has bloomed for months, those seed heads are starting to get heavy. So instead of standing upright, it's starting to splay outward. So just cutting it to the ground will, you know, it'll start all over and be back in bloom again. So, you know, depends on why you're cutting it back. It is, if it's to make it more compact, probably by midsummer. Not all chrysanthemums get real tall and flop. This is a low-growing one called Venus. It's a daisy mum. Starts out mostly white but turns pale pink. And at the back here, you see the same aster that we saw a few minutes ago that had been cut back hard maybe 6 weeks ago. So come October when it blooms, it's only going to be about 3 foot tall. But then another sort of the opposite situation. This is a florist chrysanthemum, a green flowered one called Froggy. And you imagine if you're growing a florist chrysanthemum, you want long stems for cutting. But as a garden plant, it gets really tall. And you see it's already, it knew it was going to be in this demonstration today, so very thoughtfully flopped over, but it needs to be cut back hard so that it will branch out and maybe stand up this fall. So I've cut it back really hard, but it should look great in October. And these could be stuck as cuttings, but I think it's not that good a garden plant since it gets so very tall. See, I left about a foot on the plant in the ground, and that's almost 3 foot tall. So it's a good 4 footer. Maybe it needs to go at the back of a planting. We really enjoy the single chrysanthemums because they're in full bloom in very late summer or early fall, and extremely highly used by pollinators at that time of the year. Do we have any questions at this point? What?
We do have a couple of questions, Doug. We have someone that has gladiolas, and of course they're flowering right now and flopping over a little bit. Any suggestions for Denise and how she can keep them upright so she can enjoy them?
Yeah, gladiolus almost always flop over. JC liked to plant them around yuccas, partly so it looked like the yuccas had fabulous flowers. So I think in part providing neighbors that might support him, like a low dense shrub. But yeah, no, the gladiolus generally do flop over.
Well, it's not really a direct answer on my part for Denise, but she can also cut them and bring them inside.
Yeah, and sometimes when they've flopped over and the stems have sort of grown back up to the sunlight, they have these wonderful curves, twists and turns for a flower arrangement.
Yeah. Mine flopped over in the weekend when I was out gardening, so I put it in a vase and it looked lovely. We have a double question from Mary Ann. She'd like to know if you cut back salvia and lantana.
Yeah, you can certainly cut back both. You know, lantana is going to shortly be back in bloom, provided it has proper growing conditions, you know, sun. Depends on what type of salvia. Most of the salvias that bloom for, you know, all summer long, you cut them back, they'll soon be back in bloom. You know, maybe about another 3 to 5 weeks after you cut them back, they'll be back in bloom.
Okay. And I think the chase tree behind us has inspired a question from Maggie. Sure. She'd like to know if you cut those back.
These chase tree are the selection Shoal Creek, which is a full-size growing one. And I've seen them where they're never pruned back, and they probably get close to 20 feet tall. They're really gorgeous trees at that size. But if you need to keep them shorter, you can cut them back even to the ground. I think we
were lost again.
We're lost again? You know, standing around and looking pretty is far harder than I want to work.
I mean, we're on the building's Wi-Fi now.
Spectacular in bloom. You can cut them back. You can treat them like a butterfly bush. You don't want to cut them back in midsummer, which is what we're.
So Mark is answering them directly.
Back,
yeah.
Right spring, right as it's starting to grow, you cut them back hard, and you can keep them like a bush.
I have no clue why we keep on dropping out. Before it was that gizmo.
Does it seem to have an impact when Mark talks?
No, we get disconnected.
That's what I'm asking.
No, Mark has nothing to do with disconnecting us.
Recording in progress.
There are some menardas that do great from cutting back and rebloom as well. We can ask Doug about that, but as he's back on here now. But over to you, Chris.
Yeah, we're back on, but I missed the topic, Mark.
I had just gotten down to the menarda question. I'm going to let him tackle that.
Okay, I don't see the menarda. I think it came through and we got disconnected yet again. Someone's asking about menarda and how can they manage that one for height, Doug?
Managing height of menarda, buy a selection that's the height you want. Plant breeders have been stumpifying them for a long time, so you can buy some that only get like 12 inches tall. If you don't want one that gets 4 foot tall, then don't buy one that grows 4 foot tall. That's probably the best solution is in cultivar selection.
Okay, and the final question that we have, also from Denise again, is she'd like to know, can she cut back Harlequin glory bower?
That's clerodendron?
I believe so.
It's a shrub. You know, it's certainly going to regrow if you cut it back. I'm not sure if you cut it back this late relative to that plant, whether it'll manage to bloom this year. I'd be inclined to cut it back in late winter so it has all summer to regrow and bloom.
So we had a clarification on the menarda question. They were wondering if you cut back your menarda, will that one flower again?
Well, a little bit. I don't think it'd be much of a display.
Okay.
Yeah. And there was a question about the Vitex before. It's not exactly cutting it back, but we will deadhead it 2 or 3 times over the summer. Sort of blooms in flushes and waves. When these go by, we'll cut it back below each flower cluster, and it will rebloom some if you don't do that, but it'll rebloom more if you deadhead it after each flush of bloom. And then come fall, we'll stop deadheading it. The seed heads are attractive all winter long.
And okay, we got just a last minute question, it looks like. How about cutting back Coreopsis lanceolata after flowering and powdery mildew? Will that one rebloom?
Coreopsis lanceolata might rebloom some if you cut it back. It also does a strange thing that up above ground, it makes these adventitious plantlets up where it had bloomed. And so when you cut it back, you can often take those stems and just stick it in the ground, and because they already have little root initials anyway, and just stick it in the ground and they usually root out and you'll have fresh plants. That common Coreopsis lanceolata is a short-lived perennial. So either start new ones from seed or refresh it by, starting new plants of it.
Cool, I've not seen that one. Well, that was the last question in the chat that I have. So looks like it's a good time to sign off. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you so much, Doug, for spending some time out in the garden with us and teaching us how to tame some tall perennials.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone. We look forward to seeing you next week in the Horticulture Hour, where we're going to be here to answer all of your horticultural questions. I hope you can make it out in the garden, because it certainly is a lovely day today, and I think tomorrow's going to be just as nice.